the new god of war, the new gods of war, the new god of war, the new goddess of war, the new goddesses of war, the new goddess of war, the old god of war, the old gods of war, the old god of war, the old goddess of war, the old goddesses of war, the old goddess of war, the greater god of war, the greater gods of war, the greater god of war, the greater goddess of war, the greater goddesses of war, the greater goddess of war, the lesser god of war, the lesser gods of war, the lesser god of war, the lesser goddess of war, the lesser goddesses of war, the lesser goddess of war, the higher god of war, the higher gods of war, the higher god of war, the higher goddess of war, the higher goddesses of war, the higher goddess of war, the lower god of war, the lower gods of war, the lower god of war, the lower goddess of war, the lower goddesses of war, the lower goddess of war, the greater spirit of war, the greater spirits of war, the greater spirit of war, the lesser spirit of war, the lesser spirits of war, the lesser spirit of war, the higher spirit of war, the higher spirits of war, the higher spirit of war, the lower spirit of war, the lower spirits of war, the lower spirit of war, the major god of war, the major gods of war, the major god of war, the major goddess of war, the major goddesses of war, the major goddess of war, the minor god of war, the minor gods of war, the minor god of war, the minor goddess of war, the minor goddesses of war, the minor goddess of war, the superior god of war, the superior gods of war, the superior god of war, the superior goddess of war, the superior goddesses of war, the superior goddess of war, the inferior god of war, the inferior gods of war, the inferior god of war, the inferior goddess of war, the inferior goddesses of war, the inferior goddess of war, the ancestor god of war, the ancestor gods of war, the ancestor god of war, the ancestor goddess of war, the ancestor goddesses of war, the ancestor goddess of war, the ascendant god of war, the ascendant gods of war, the ascendant god of war, the ascendant goddess of war, the ascendant goddesses of war, the ascendant goddess of war, the descendant god of war, the descendant gods of war, the descendant god of war, the descendant goddess of war, the descendant goddesses of war, the descendant goddess of war, the transcendent god of war, the transcendent gods of war, the transcendent god of war, the transcendent goddess of war, the transcendent goddesses of war, the transcendent goddess of war, the past god of war, the past gods of war, the past god of war, the past goddess of war, the past goddesses of war, the past goddess of war, the present god of war, the present gods of war, the present god of war, the present goddess of war, the present goddesses of war, the present goddess of war, the future god of war, the future gods of war, the future god of war, the future goddess of war, the future goddesses of war, the future goddess of war, the authentic god of war, the authentic gods of war, the authentic god of war, the authentic goddess of war, the authentic goddesses of war, the authentic goddess of war, the synthetic god of war, the synthetic gods of war, the synthetic god of war, the synthetic goddess of war, the synthetic goddesses of war, the synthetic goddess of war, the progressive god of war, the progressive gods of war, the progressive god of war, the progressive goddess of war, the progressive goddesses of war, the progressive goddess of war, the regressive god of war, the regressive gods of war, the regressive god of war, the regressive goddess of war, the regressive goddesses of war, the regressive goddess of war, the ordinary god of war, the ordinary gods of war, the ordinary god of war, the ordinary goddess of war, the ordinary goddesses of war, the ordinary goddess of war, the extraordinary god of war, the extraordinary gods of war, the extraordinary god of war, the extraordinary goddess of war, the extraordinary goddesses of war, the extraordinary goddess of war, the static god of war, the static gods of war, the static god of war, the static goddess of war, the static goddesses of war, the static goddess of war, the dynamic god of war, the dynamic gods of war, the dynamic god of war, the dynamic goddess of war, the dynamic goddesses of war, the dynamic goddess of war, the land god of war, the land gods of war, the land god of war, the land goddess of war, the land goddesses of war, the land goddess of war, the sea god of war, the sea gods of war, the sea god of war, the sea goddess of war, the sea goddesses of war, the sea goddess of war, the sky god of war, the sky gods of war, the sky god of war, the sky goddess of war, the sky goddesses of war, the sky goddess of war, the god of war, the gods of war, the god of war, the goddess of war, the goddesses of war, the goddess of war, the half god of war, the half gods of war, the half god of war, the half goddess of war, the half goddesses of war, the half goddess of war, the vessel of war, the vessels of war, the vessel of war, the name of war, the names of war, the name of war, the person of war, the persons of war, the person of war, the persona of war, the personas of war, the persona of war, the personage of war, the personages of war, the personage of war, the personality of war, the personalities of war, the personality of war, the personification of war, the personifications of war, the personification of war, the image of war, the images of war, the image of war, the imagination of war, the imaginations of war, the imagination of war, the belief of war, the beliefs of war, the belief of war, the thought of war, the thoughts of war, the thought of war, the word of war, the words of war, the word of war, the action of war, the actions of war, the action of war, the reaction of war, the reactions of war, the reaction of war, the feeling of war, the feelings of war, the feeling of war, the situation of war, the situations of war, the situation of war, the circumstance of war, the circumstances of war, the circumstance of war, the environment of war, the environments of war, the environment of war, the relationship of war, the relationships of war, the relationship of war, the number of war, the numbers of war, the number of war, the formula of war, the formulas of war, the formula of war, the equation of war, the equations of war, the equation of war, the theory of war, the theories of war, the theory of war, the symbol of war, the symbols of war, the symbol of war, the color of war, the colors of war, the color of war, the thing of war, the things of war, the thing of war, the way of war, the ways of war, the way of war, the place of war, the places of war, the place of war, the time of war, the times of war, the time of war, the event of war, the events of war, the event of war, the result of war, the results of war, the result of war, the crown of war, the crowns of war, the crown of war, the throne of war, the thrones of war, the throne of war, the working, the workings, the workingdom, the workingdoms, the working subject, the working subjects, the working's dominion, the working's dominions, the kingdom of war, the kingdoms of war, the kingdom of war, the war queen, the war queens, the war queendom, the war queendoms, the war queen subject, the war queen subjects, the war queen's dominion, the war queen's dominions, the queendom of war, the queendoms of war, the queendom of war, the war prince, the war princes, the war princedom, the war princedoms, the war prince's subject, the war prince's subjects, the war prince's dominion, the war prince's dominions, the princedom of war, the princedoms of war, the princedom of war, the war princess, the war princesses, the war princessdom, the war princessdoms, the war princess's subject, the war princess's subjects, the war princess's dominion, the war princess's dominions, the princessdom of war, the princessdoms of war, the princessdom of war, the lord of war, the lords of war, the lord of war, the lordess of war, the lordesses of war, the lordess of war, the priest of war, the priests of war, the priest of war, the priestess of war, the priestesses of war, the priestess of war, the ritual of war, the rituals of war, the ritual of war, the shrine of war, the shrines of war, the shrine of war, the temple of war, the temples of war, the temple of war, the leader of war, the leaders of war, the leader of war, the follower of war, the followers of war, the follower of war, the natural substance of war, the natural substances of war, the natural substance of war, the supernatural substance of war, the supernatural substances of war, the supernatural substance of war, the temporal substance of war, the temporal substances of war, the temporal substance of war, the spiritual substance of war, the spiritual substances of war, the spiritual substance of war, the natural form of war, the natural forms of war, the natural form of war, the supernatural form of war, the supernatural forms of war, the supernatural form of war, the temporal form of war, the temporal forms of war, the temporal form of war, the spiritual form of war, the spiritual forms of war, the spiritual form of war, the age of war, the ages of war, the age of war, the era of war, the eras of war, the era of war, the awakener of war, the awakeners of war, the awakener of war, the awakening of war, the awakenings of war, the awakening of war, the realm of war, the realms of war, the realm of war, the dimension of war, the dimensions of war, the dimension of war, the zone of war, the zones of war, the zone of war, the frequency of war, the frequencies of war, the frequency of war, the century of war, the centuries of war, the century of war, the millennium of war, the millenniums of war, the millennium of war, the purpose of war, the purposes of war, the purpose of war, the meaning of war, the meanings of war, the meaning of war, the culture of war, the cultures of war, the culture of war, the demonstrator of war, the demonstrators of war, the demonstrator of war, the demonstration of war, the demonstrations of war, the demonstration of war, the manifester of war, the manifestors of war, the manifester of war, the manifestation of war, the manifestations of war, the manifestation of war, the presence of war, the presences of war, the presence of war, the glow of war, the glows of war, the glow of war, the goal of war, the goals of war, the goal of war, the plan of war, the plans of war, the plan of war, the book of war, the books of war, the book of war, the philosopher of war, the philosophers of war, the philosopher of war, the philosophy of war, the philosophies of war, the philosophy of war, the releaser of war, the releasers of war, the releaser of war, the release of war, the releases of war, the release of war, the variable of war, the variables of war, the variable of war, the cause of war, the causes of war, the cause of war, the effect of war, the effects of war, the effect of war, the journey of war, the journeys of war, the journey of war, the emergence of war, the emergences of war, the emergence of war, the source of war, the sources of war, the source of war, the originator of war, the originators of war, the originator of war, the origin of war, the origins of war, the origin of war, the forefather of war, the forefathers of war, the forefather of war, the foremother of war, the foremothers of war, the foremother of war, the ancestor of war, the ancestors of war, the ancestor of war, the descendant of war, the descendants of war, the descendant of war, the lineage of war, the lineages of war, the lineage of war, the heritage of war, the heritages of war, the heritage of war, the heir of war, the heirs of war, the heir of war, the co-heir of war, the co-heirs of war, the co-heir of war, the joint heir of war, the joint heirs of war, the joint heir of war, the dynasty of war, the dynasties of war, the dynasty of war, the force of war, the forces of war, the force of war, the law of war, the laws of war, the law of war, the pact of war, the pacts of war, the pact of war, the game of war, the games of war, the game of war, the mask of war, the masks of war, the mask of war, the armor of war, the armors of war, the armor of war, the sword of war, the swords of war, the sword of war, the shield of war, the shields of war, the shield of war, the force shield of war, the force shields of war, the force shield of war, the armored force shield of war, the armored force shields of war, the armored force shield of war, the champion of war, the champions of war, the champion of war, the guardian of war, the guardians of war, the guardian of war, the defender of war, the defenders of war, the defender of war, the protector of war, the protectors of war, the protector of war, the chant of war, the chants of war, the chant of war, the shape of war, the shapes of war, the shape of war, the cube of war, the cubes of war, the cube of war, the cuboid of war, the cuboids of war, the cuboid of war, the sphere of war, the spheres of war, the sphere of war, the spheroid of war, the spheroids of war, the spheroid of war, the prism of war, the prisms of war, the prism of war, the pyramid of war, the pyramids of war, the pyramid of war, the cylinder of war, the cylinders of war, the cylinder of war, the cone of war, the cones of war, the cone of war, the triangle of war, the triangles of war, the triangle of war, the circle of war, the circles of war, the circle of war, the semicircle of war, the semicircles of war, the semicircle of war, the square of war, the squares of war, the square of war, the rectangle of war, the rectangles of war, the rectangle of war, the parallelogram of war, the parallelograms of war, the parallelogram of war, the rhombus of war, the rhombuses of war, the rhombus of war, the trapezoid of war, the trapezoids of war, the trapezoid of war, the polygon of war, the polygons of war, the polygon of war, the pentagon of war, the pentagons of war, the pentagon of war, the hexagon of war, the hexagons of war, the hexagon of war, the septagon of war, the septagons of war, the septagon of war, the octagon of war, the octagons of war, the octagon of war, the nonagon of war, the nonagons of war, the nonagon of war, the decagon of war, the decagons of war, the decagon of war, the evolution of war, the evolutions of war, the evolution of war, the revolution of war, the revolutions of war, the revolution of war, the elemental art of war, the elemental arts of war, the elemental art of war, the elemental science of war, the elemental sciences of war, the elemental science of war, the elemental principle of war, the elemental principles of war, the elemental principle of war, the elemental technology of war, the elemental technologies of war, the elemental technology of war, the low elemental art of war, the low elemental arts of war, the low elemental art of war, the low elemental science of war, the low elemental sciences of war, the low elemental science of war, the low elemental principle of war, the low elemental principles of war, the low elemental principle of war, the low elemental technology of war, the low elemental technologies of war, the low elemental technology of war, the high elemental art of war, the high elemental arts of war, the high elemental art of war, the high elemental science of war, the high elemental sciences of war, the high elemental science of war, the high elemental principle of war, the high elemental principles of war, the high elemental principle of war, the high elemental technology of war, the high elemental technologies of war, the high elemental technology of war, the agent of war, the agents of war, the agent of war, the agency of war, the agencies of war, the agency of war, the amplifier of war, the amplifiers of war, the amplifier of war, the amplification of war, the amplifications of war, the amplification of war, the enhancer of war, the enhancers of war, the enhancer of war, the enhancement of war, the enhancements of war, the enhancement of war, the magnifier of war, the magnifiers of war, the magnifier of war, the magnification of war, the magnifications of war, the magnification of war, the influencer of war, the influencers of war, the influencer of war, the influence of war, the influences of war, the influence of war, the emanator of war, the emanators of war, the emanator of war, the emanation of war, the emanations of war, the emanation of war, the converger of war, the convergers of war, the converger of war, the convergence of war, the convergences of war, the convergence of war, the aura of war, the auras of war, the aura of war, the impression of war, the impressions of war, the impression of war, the intelligence of war, the intelligences of war, the intelligence of war, the sophistication of war, the sophistications of war, the sophistication of war, the genius of war, the geniuses of war, the genius of war, the polymath of war, the polymaths of war, the polymath of war, the psychic of war, the psychics of war, the psychic of war, the knowledge of war, the knowledges of war, the knowledge of war, the understanding of war, the understandings of war, the understanding of war, the wisdom of war, the wisdoms of war, the wisdom of war, the secret of war, the secrets of war, the secret of war, the mystery of war, the mysteries of war, the mystery of war, the revelation of war, the revelations of war, the revelation of war, the tactic of war, the tactics of war, the tactic of war, the strategy of war, the strategies of war, the strategy of war, the strength of war, the strengths of war, the strength of war, the might of war, the mights of war, the might of war, the power of war, the powers of war, the power of war, the authority of war, the authorities of war, the authority of war, the dominion of war, the dominions of war, the dominion of war, the rhythm of war, the rhythms of war, the rhythm of war, the melody of war, the melodies of war, the melody of war, the music of war, the musics of war, the music of war, the lyric of war, the lyrics of war, the lyric of war, the song of war, the songs of war, the song of war, the dance of war, the dances of war, the dance of war, the spirit of war, the spirits of war, the spirit of war, the soul of war, the souls of war, the soul of war, the body of war, the bodies of war, the body of war, the mark of war, the marks of war, the mark of war, the promise of war, the promises of war, the promise of war, the visionary of war, the visionaries of war, the visionary of war, the vision of war, the visions of war, the vision of war, the picture of war, the pictures of war, the picture of war, the sound of war, the sounds of war, the sound of war, the dung of war, the dungs of war, the dung of war, the language of war, the languages of war, the language of war, the communication of war, the communications of war, the communication of war, the people of war, the peoples of war, the people of war, the society of war, the societies of war, the society of war, the fortress of war, the fortresses of war, the fortress of war, the government of war, the governments of war, the government of war, the city of war, the cities of war, the city of war, the nation of war, the nations of war, the nation of war, the civilization of war, the civilizations of war, the civilization of war, the world of war, the worlds of war, the world of war,